I'm Christian Wolmar, and welcome to Calling All Stations, the podcast that focuses on transport issues. And with me, as usual, is Mark Walker of Cogitamus.
Hello, Christian. In today's episode, we are shortly going to be returning to the issue of young drivers in the UK and what can be done to make their use of the roads safer for themselves and everybody else. But first of all, we're going to examine the catastrophic accident on India's railways that took place just a few days ago, a subject with which you're very familiar, and I believe you've even travelled on the line where the accident happened.
I did indeed about 5, 6 years ago, and it goes through a kind of tribal part of India, pretty poor and pretty undeveloped, and where in fact a lot of the workers, and this was on the train, were heading for Chennai to the south, that used to be called Madras, to get work for the summer months, and they were travelling on the train, which is one of the reasons why these services were so overcrowded. And I wrote a piece for the Sunday Times about the accident, which is available on my website. And I made a rather important point, actually, because in the immediate aftermath of the accident, there was a lot of kind of almost kind of racist stuff about, oh, they were packed in like sardines, the implication they were kind of sitting on the top of the train and that sort of thing, which there are lots of pictures of that in India, but it's by no means the norm. Trains run in India like they run everywhere else, and people are safely inside the carriages, and they're certainly not packed in like sardines on these regional services, which have very long trains. They're kind of 24 carriage long trains. Most of them are sleeper compartments, with maybe 50, 60 people in each one, pretty much open plan, very much like, if people are familiar with films, Some Like It Hot, famous Marilyn Monroe film that shows a sleeper train. It's very much like that, kind of open plan, kind of dorm type sleeping accommodation. And I was trying to correct two things, actually. First of all, that impression that, the Indian railways are still stuck in kind of very primitive form of transport stuff, which is not the case. It's a modern railway network where you buy your ticket via computer and so on. And the other part of what I was trying to correct is that it has lots of accidents, and that this is just one of a kind of regular series of accidents. And in fact, yes, there are still an occasional very serious accident, but it's nothing like in the last century when this sort of accident was quite commonplace. And indeed, the rate of accidents has reduced by a tenth, to a tenth of what it was at the end of the last century. I mean, that is a remarkable improvement in safety, and that's a measure that is taken as a serious incidents, that are recorded, and that has reduced dramatically. So I just thought that there was a lot of correction to be done. And then, of course, I've written a book called Railways for the Raj on the Indian railways, and I sort of also wanted to correct the impression that often comes about, which is that we built the railway network out of the kindness of our hearts for the Indians, and they were terribly grateful, and colonialism was a terribly good idea. In fact, the truth is that we built the railways there largely with initially British money, but then subsidized by Indian money, Indian taxpayers' money, and we built the railways for our own purposes, mainly to facilitate exports and to also help imports into the kind of Indian heartland. And it was only later that these early railway companies realized that there was a lot of profit to be made out of transporting large numbers of local people in pretty primitive third class conditions. And a lot of these companies then became highly profitable, and they were still, these profits went to the City of London. So it was not kind of, a great colonial favor we did. It was, in fact, self-interest. I'm not saying that it wasn't of great benefit to the Indians. In fact, the rail network in India remains intensely used and greatly loved. Actually, I mean, people are very proud of the rail network. And indeed, when Nehru took over after independence in 1948, he actually built up the railways enormously, expanded them, invested in them, took them over, and right from the start, it was seen as a very important part of growing the Indian economy. So there's a big story to tell there, and lots of interesting things. And of course, the accident itself, was we don't know what it was caused by, but it seems that a train was somehow dispatched into a sidetrack, sidings where there was already a freight train. And why the signaling kind of worked in that way, we haven't yet found out. But it wasn't a signal past at danger by a driver. It was certainly something to do with the signaling. And indeed, it has slight resonance with the Clapham rail disaster, actually, Mark, because there were 3 trains involved, which was the same in Clapham, and it was also something technically wrong with the signalling system, and that was certainly the case with Clapham as well. So, it had certainly resonances, and we need to, of course, find out exactly what the cause was.
And I dare say that's a subject we'll be returning to in future podcasts as
Absolutely
more information emerges. Loyal listeners will know that in episode 14 of Calling All Stations, we discussed the suggestions that had been in the media that the UK government was looking to restrict the activities and freedoms of young drivers, newly qualified young drivers, possibly limiting the number of other passengers they might carry in vehicles. On safety grounds, on the basis that more accidents tend to occur around young drivers. As a result of that discussion, we made contact with an organisation called the Under 17 Car Club, who exist for the sole purpose, really, of improving the skills of young people even before they're allowed out on the roads as learners and as qualified drivers. And Christian, you've met and interviewed some of the people running the club.
Yes, I thought this was such an interesting idea, and I'd never heard about this, that I decided to interview a couple of people, John Beckford and Chris Singer, who are 2 trustees of the Under 17 Car Club, who explained to me that this has enormously positive results, and they are greatly reducing the number of accidents which the people who go through their courses have, compared with the young drivers in general. And so they gave me a really interesting account of how they're working, and something that they want to spread out more generally. Accident rates amongst young teenage drivers are particularly high. And so I decided to go along to talk to 2 people involved in teaching under 17s to drive. Now, that might sound unusual, but this apparently is a way of reducing the risk. So I'm joined by Chris Singer and John Beckford, trustees of the Under 17 Car Club. And perhaps we'll start off with John and tell me a bit about yourself and how you got involved in this project.
So getting involved in it was very simple. When my 13-year-old son wanted to learn to drive, I took him along to the under-17 car club, and that was well over 20 years ago. And like many parents, the club relies on people to run it. So we got involved in not just being in the club, but in running the club. And out of that emerged lots and lots of other activities. So the club started life as an opportunity for young people to learn to drive, but it has become, particularly over the last 10 years, very, very focused on addressing this key problem that young people going on the road are at much greater risk than their older peers, and we needed to do something about it.
So, Chris, you're a police officer, I understand, with involvement in this.
Yeah, so I'm a former police officer. I did my full-time service, and when I was quite a senior officer up in the West Midlands, I was made aware of the activities of the Under-17 Car Club, and in particular the Pathfinder component of that, and went along in uniform. And within about 10 minutes of arriving at the venue where it was being staged, was being driven around very competently by a young 15 or 16-year-old driver. And I just saw in action the delivery of steps that make an undoubted contribution to road safety. And I do think it's worthwhile just saying at this point that, we frequently will talk about road traffic accidents. They're not accidents. An accident is something that's unforeseen and unavoidable. What happens on our roads is foreseen and avoidable. It's very, very rare that something happens on a road that can't be mitigated against. And what we do within the car club, and particularly Pathfinder and the other activities of the car club, our sister organisation, is work to avoid the avoidable. So working with those young drivers, we work with them to make sure that those things which we can foresee, young drivers who will get behind a wheel, inexperienced, and take risks, we work against that to provide them with the skills that will equip them for a lifetime of safer driving.
So what is the cause of this high rate? Is it just inexperience? Is it young, largely men, kind of getting hold of a big vehicle and driving too fast? So why is there such a high rate?
So that's an interesting question, Christian, and one that's been bothering us for a long time. Fundamentally, we teach young people not enough of the right things. We teach them in an urban environment at very low speeds and dealing with the world of right angles. When they get to the age of 17 and the first freedom they get is a driving license, they have a propensity to go and drive too fast and drive too carelessly because they don't understand what is going on. So if we go back to the sort of the origins of the question that we came to you with, is the notion of graduated driving license is necessary because it's pointed to a fundamental problem with the current system of training and testing that we apply to young people. So we're trying to address a problem that the stable first-time pass rate of around 50% for young people taking a driving test suggests that the process itself is stable. So what we are teaching people is wrong because the consequences of what they're being taught is this A, 50% failure rate, B, a 20% or thereabouts collision rate in their first 12 months on the road. Those have been stable.
Say that again. Really, there's that high a risk of a collision in their first year of driving.
Yes, it's 1 in 4.5 according to DFT statistics.
Gosh.
And that's a reportable collision, so that's damage to people or property. So it's not a minor curb strike. It's actually somebody's thumped a wall, or they thumped another car, or they thumped a person. And that's happening because what we're teaching them to do, typically through a conventional ADI process, is essentially to pass a driving test. We are not teaching them, in essence, to drive. We're doing it in constrained environments, and we understand all the reasons why this is the case. But what it ends up with is a need for somebody to say, there is a better way of doing this. By teaching different things, we can reflect that what we've got is a failure of process, not candidate at the moment. It is not the candidates that are failing, it's the process that is failing the candidates.
What are you doing to break that model then?
So what we do is we take young people with a parent, and this is key. So our young people come along with a parent or other suitable adult, and they work with that parent and in their own car to work through a very, very highly structured process where, frankly, the technical content is the same as the DVSA process. It's the same knobs, levers, steering wheels, buttons that they have to learn to use. Right. But most young people master that in a very short period of time. What we then work on with them and their progress through the club and through Pathfinder relies on their behavior and attitude to driving. And we encourage safety positive thinking. We promote risk-aware thinking so that we're developing thinking, thoughtful drivers rather than simply mechanical drivers. And we do that by making them aware of the risks. So that what are the causes of the fatal five? What are the consequences of that? Not
Sorry,
just
the fatal five. What's
fatal
that?
five. Chris, you'll have to list these. They are speed, they are drugs, they are drink, they're
it's speed, impairment, and I've forgotten the rest of them.
essentially sort of lack of concentration, lack of skill, and we don't teach through the DVSA process. We're teaching in largely urban environments, and that's a function of where people live. When you put a young person then out into a rural environment, they're traveling more quickly. The dynamics of the vehicle change quite dramatically as they get up to higher speeds. And again, as they increase the loading in the car, so a small car with 4 people in it handles very differently to a small car with 1 person in it. And they do not understand the limits of the dynamics of the vehicle. So, yeah, the classic crash is midnight to 2 a.m. on a Saturday. It's wet. It's a country road with an overloaded small car. And it's crashed in the first instance because the young person was driving too fast. There's no sort of arguing with that. But they're driving too fast for the conditions and the vehicle. And they don't have a skill set that enables them to recognize what's going wrong and correct it. So they're braking hard to slow for a bend. They lose traction on the road, and rather than lifting their foot off and trying to steer and drive around the bend, they push harder on the brake pedal, which exacerbates the problem rather than solves it. And that's because they haven't been taught anything else. They haven't been taught.
So you'll call the under 17. So you start with people who are under 17. So obviously the obvious question is where do you do this, because you can't do it legally on the road. But what are you doing exactly?
So so in terms of the 2 organisations that we have, the car club starts with 11-year-olds. So
wow.
11-year-olds driving. The Pathfinder is normally sort of the rising 17s, those who are heading towards their driving test. We use a variety of locations, some MOD land and other sort of circuits and such like. Clearly, as you say, they have to be private so that they are not roads. So they are absolutely private, secure, gated venues. Not accessible by the public at all. And we, as John has said, we take them through a graduated approach. The mechanical skills, day 1, sort of day 1 plus 2. And then we start getting them to drive ahead. And we use, with our constant reference point, is the manual that's called Roadcraft, which is the emergency services manual of driving skills, which talks about all the time working to a system to control your driving on the road, information, position, speed, gear, and acceleration in that order. And what we see is sort of day 1, day 2, the young drivers are very much driving around what's going on in their car. They're concentrating on changing gear. They're concentrating on all those sort of things. We teach them over the 5 days then to start driving ahead. What's happening ahead of your vehicle, way ahead of your vehicle? Respond to that. Think about where the safest place for your car to be on the road is. Think about the speed you need to be at. What gear do you need to be in so you can hold that speed and then accelerate clear of the hazard? So it's a really realistic program, and we do emulate realistic road conditions with them so that they can see what it's like when they get out on the road. And the evidence that we collect is testament to the fact that, as John has said, 1 in 4.5 young drivers will have a collision in their first 12 months of driving. We dramatically reduce that incident, those incidents.
Have you got figures on that?
Yep.
Yeah.
Back over to John, because he'll quote them exactly.
It's 1 in 19 across all of our surveys.
Wow.
So it's a dramatic effect. We survey the young people from the car club and from Pathfinder, and we've done it now consistently for very nearly 20 years, with students going back as late as the mid 1990s. And although the numbers are small, because we can only survey the people that we've worked with, they are consistent. So that what we're doing is demonstrating that it can be different, and that by changing the way we think about the process of driving, the process of learning about driving, the skills that are required to be safe, and then engaging, and it is really important, is we engage young people and their parents, and both Chris and I have taken our young people through this process.
So what sort of numbers are we talking about? Are you a national organisation, or are you only local at the moment, or what?
We're a tiny organisation. We're a small, entirely voluntary-run charity. Right. I say small. There are about 70 volunteers on the Pathfinder side and 100 and something on the car club side. So they're not that small. Nobody takes a penny out of it, and everything is funded either by parental subscriptions for car club, or with support from police and crime commissioners in a few parts of the country. So we operate. The Pathfinder operates in Yorkshire, across Staffordshire and the West Mercia area, and down into Gloucestershire and Wiltshire. But we accept candidates from anywhere in the country, and where we exclude nobody, and this is important, on financial grounds. So one of the criticisms is, but you're all posh white middle class parents. Of course it's good for you. So we make sure that we reach out and accommodate students who financially can't afford it, who might otherwise be excluded on educational grounds or whatever, or even health grounds, and we never turn somebody away.
So the Pathfinder is for over 17s who are the car club is for under 17s. Is that right?
Yeah, the rising Pathfinder is typically 15 to 17-year-olds. Right. So it's just in that last year before they go on the road where we get the opportunity to give them the privilege of driving, and it is a privilege, excuse me, and accompany that because we believe we understand something about education, and we've both been involved heavily in management education, management writing, by changing the information that's available to the young people, by helping them to understand what is going on around them, by helping them, and this is about the parental involvement, by trusting them to behave in the right way and showing them what that looks and feels like, they engage with the learning and they go away not just better, safer young drivers, but actually better and safer young people.
Okay, so if this is such a good scheme, which it sounds like, presumably you are trying to get this as part of the official process. Is that something that you envisage, or will it just remain always a kind of a charitable add-on, as it were?
I mean, there's no doubt that the sort of the practical difficulties of making it a mandatory requirement for all drivers would be significant. So I think the availability is key, and we certainly have expanded the places in which we operate. Yorkshire came online about 3 or 4 years ago, and we're constantly looking at how and where we can expand, and in dialogue with police and crime commissioners and others in other parts of the country. So we are keen to increase the offer because we know it works. And I think the important thing as well here is this is something that works with the young drivers. I'm not going to knock the importance of regulation, and clearly from my background, enforcement is clearly a component in regulating what goes on our roads, but that's not the sole answer. And what we're concentrating on here is the educational aspect. And as John has said, bringing in those life skills. Driving there's more involved in driving than simply the mechanical control of the vehicle. It involves all of the constituent elements of the person's approach to their driving. Are they steady, measured, and giving consideration to what's going on around them? All of those are things that education will foster. You can't regulate somebody to start thinking about where is the safest place for my car to be on the road. You can't regulate somebody to start thinking about what their attitude is towards their driving. You know, you see the billboards that say don't drive when you're tired and all of those sort of things. Well, you can't actually, you know, sure, you can punish people if they drive while they're tired and they have a collision, but that's not the same. So what we're doing is something fundamentally different. We're changing attitudes. We're enforcing. We're bringing about. We're educating attitudes in relation to driving, and that's where we're working with the young drivers, not seeking to impose something upon them. You know, I think the whole aspect around graduated driving license is that it is an admission.
Sorry, could you explain graduated driving license?
Yeah, so I mean, graduated driving license is simply an approach that somebody earns their driving license through a test, but post that process is then entered into a process that graduates how they can then earn their right, if you like, to drive freely on the road at their own direction. So, for instance, some of the component parts of them may be curfews. Some of the component parts of graduated driving license, which may restrict the number of people you can take in a car. You know, other countries and some of the states in America have systems in place where new young drivers are not allowed to drive after a certain period in the evening.
Is this something you're advocating?
No, absolutely. No. Because I mean, for a start, there are unintended consequences. If you restrict the number of people who can be carried in a vehicle, then all you're actually doing is magnifying the number of vehicles that are going to be on the road.
Right.
So instead of one car carrying 5 people, you can have cars carrying 5 people. It magnifies that there's a potential there, particularly in terms of young females, for them to be actually at greater risk.
Because they can't be given a lift by their mates. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's all sorts of potential unintended consequences of it. And it doesn't actually solve the problem. Because all you're doing is restricting and creating a set of restrictions that don't improve driving in their own right at all. And I think it's really interesting. Just the other week, a local associate of mine, a friend of mine, who has a daughter who's just 17 now, who'd gone through a whole load of driving lessons and had taken her driving test twice and not passed it, and unfortunately not been able to attend Pathfinder despite wanting to, but it was elsewhere in the country. So I took her out for 2 or 3 sessions on the road, and I was just observing the things that she hadn't learnt during the course of her driving lessons and preparation for the driving test that I knew would help keep her safer on the roads.
Like,
for instance, a really simple one, on a main road, driving along, vehicle waiting at a junction to the near side. And I said to her, can you see the driver's eyes? Are they looking at you? And she looked and she said, oh, yes, I can see her. I said, right, now, what does that tell you? And she said, well, she's seen me. Yeah, great. Now, she had never, ever been told that. So
right.
she'd never been told that.
As a lifelong cyclist who's managed to stay alive till my 70s, that is the number one thing I do. That if I'm cycling along and there's somebody on the side and I can't see their eyes, I slow down. I absolutely, I only go forward if I see their eyes. Absolutely.
And I think that's a really, I mean, it's a really simple thing, but it's a really good indicator of where we're not preparing people for the road. And I'm not knocking ADIs. They have a really tough job to do. I absolutely get that. But the point I'm making there is that having then learned that, she was then applying it, which meant her driving was changing as a result of it, because as we were approaching junctions, she's making the conscious effort to check that the vehicle's seen them, and she's adjusting the position of the vehicle accordingly. And we use a simple mnemonic in both the Car Club and Pathfinder: concentrate, observe, anticipate, because that gives you space and time to react. Coast, concentrate, anticipate, gives you space and time. And when I went through that with her and just talked through that, she said, oh, that makes such a difference. And it did make a difference to her driving. because
Right.
she's starting to think, and she's then thinking, well, maybe I'll go a little bit slower because I can't see the driver's eyes or whatever else it might be, position off to the offside a little bit so I give myself space, all of those things. So I think it's a really good illustration of where the skills that we introduce are above the level that necessarily is expected to be seen within the driving test, but makes a significant contribution to keeping young drivers safer.
Are you mainly doing boys?
No,
No, it's almost exactly 50-50.
Oh, really?
these
That's
days.
interesting.
And
I would
that's
expect it was all young men kind of eager to get driving.
No, it's a really interesting. It's yeah, the attitudes are very different between the young people, the young boys and the young girls. But the girls are coming out increasingly, pleased to say that our particularly our marshals, but also increasing numbers of women getting involved in the instruction process. So we're not just shifting the balance that, when I first got involved 20 years ago, it was predominantly young men. Now we have more women instructors, more women marshals, women chief instructors on some of our courses, and that again helps to shift the dynamic. I think one of the important things that comes out of this is that yes, we're small, Christian, and we are trying to get bigger, and it's very difficult to grow a voluntary organisation, as I'm sure you know. But the cost of each road traffic collision with an injury is about £150,000 to the public purse, so it is reported by DFT. Participation in Pathfinder or Car Club costs a few £100s. So there's a real strong value for money equation here, which is that the work that we are doing is bringing down the cost to the public purse. So there's a financial case for this, as well as the emotional case of all the accidents that don't happen, all the young people that don't get injured as a result of being on the programme.
I mean, we've sort of addressed this already. You say we've got to talk to the police commissioners and police forces and various government agencies, but how do you see that this has been rolled out much more widely? Because clearly governments don't always think about this saving money in the long term. They just think about saving money in the short term, and this will obviously have a cost. So how are you going to get it rolled out more nationally, which is presumably your reason for talking on this podcast?
Yeah, it is. I mean, for a start, just in simple financial terms, we know because we've got the data that we can save money. It's as simple as that. So we would say to anyone who is actively involved in dealing with the consequences of road traffic collisions that we can save money. So we can save the public purse money. So whether that be health, police, fire, whatever else it might be, we would welcome the conversations. Naturally, the support that we've got from the police and crime commissioners, in addition to financial, provides us with physical resource as well. So we have police officers coming along to help instruct, which I think is absolutely superb. And we would welcome discussion with police and crime commissioners on that. Recently, our latest set of statistics was published on the Association of Police and Crime Commissioners website. So they should have all have had access to be able to see it. And that's the hard evidence that shows what we do works. So we would welcome that. And then also schools, colleges, further education institutions, we would, and indeed, employers who have a responsibility in terms of the safety of their workforce, who may be engaging with apprentices and such like. We would welcome discussions there, because the model we have is portable. Providing we can find a suitably sized venue, we can put the program together really easily. We've got the volunteers, and we're very keen, in fact, to train further volunteers so that we can just expand the offer. So really, we do welcome discussion. And the final point I'll make is this: that we have given evidence now to the Transport Select Committee, young drivers evidence gathering process, and that's something that I think is really significant, because whilst we may be a relatively small organisation, and incidentally, we do provide Pathfinder for over 300 young people on an annual basis. So actually, that's not all that small.
Not insignificant, yeah.
But for us to then have been accepted in front of the select committee, I think is really deeply significant, because it shows that we're an organisation that has gravitas and has significance. So we approach us, come speak to us.
Well, that's a very good point to end on. John and Chris, thank you so much. I wish you luck in your endeavours, and I hope that the podcast will help spread the message. So I'm going to stop recording, and thank you very much.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, Departure Lounge indeed for Boris Johnson. And why am I mentioning him in connection with a transport podcast? Well, reading the biography of Johnson in number 10 by Anthony Selden and his colleague, it's very clear that the only reason that we are continuing with building HS2 is because of Boris Johnson. This was his baby, and he resisted enormous efforts by Dominic Cummings, amongst others, senior Tory ministers, even some civil servants, to scrap HS2 when he became Prime Minister. And he had real showdowns with these people to push the program ahead, and the contracts then was sufficiently set in stone by this decision to ensure that we will get a chunk of HS2 built. We've discussed before about exactly how much. But so with the departure of Boris Johnson, it's certainly the departure of the main protagonist for HS2, and when it is completed, there might be a temptation to call it the Boris Johnson line. I suspect that won't happen, but it really was down to him that HS2 is happening.
Calling All Stations with Christian Wolmar is a Cogitamus Limited production. If you've enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @AllStationsPod.